Welcome to Long Live Alternative Parties podcast. Today, friends, we have another exciting reformer on our podcast today. His name is Greg Coleridge, and he is with an organization, a movement called Create Real Democracy. So welcome to the podcast, Greg.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation.
We are glad to have you. If you could get started by kindly giving us an introduction to yourself, a brief biographical sketch.
Yeah, well, Greg Coleridge is the name. I live in northeast Ohio. I have been working in the sort of democracy, justice, environmental realm for probably close to 40 years.
Wow.
Worked for many years, over 30 years, with an organization called the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker social action organization.
Wow.
That was the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1947. And I did that work here in Northeast Ohio, working on issues of peace, justice, environmental protection, and democracy. And for the last 7 years, I've been working for a national organization called Move to Amend, which is seeking a constitutional amendment to end the twin constitutional bizarre doctrines of a corporation is a person and money equals free speech. And sort of on the side, for many years, I have been putting together a weekly calendar called a Real Democracy History Calendar, and a second calendar called a Monetary History Calendar, both under the umbrella of the Create Real Democracy, believing that we don't really have a democracy. We technically never have had one from day one. We, the people, have never been all the people, but only a select few, originally something like between 5 and 8% white male property owners were from day one in this country. Real people, everyone else was either 3/5 of a person, or women were attached to men, had no inherent rights of their own. Indigenous people, if you look at the Declaration of Independence, which we celebrated last week on July 4th, they refer to Native people not even as any person of any percentage or category, but as beasts. So, it has taken a very long time for other persons besides white male property owners, as well as indentured servants, weren't really given the full rights of citizenship until those groups of people sort of drove themselves into the Constitution through movements. And so by real democracy, we mean, people who are coming together kind of from the bottom up and trying to create authentic democracy, which we believe needs to happen for the very first time.
Excellent. Well, that's a lot of great stuff we can talk about. So you say you're from Northeast Ohio. My parents met in Cleveland. Is Northeast Ohio close to Cleveland?
Well, I actually live in Cleveland Heights. So,
you do?
Very next door.
Oh, wow, yes. My mom loves Cleveland. She's very proud to be from Cleveland. So it has a fond place in my life indirectly.
Oh, terrific.
So we're glad you're from Cleveland.
Yeah.
We're glad you're representing Cleveland well. You're doing reform activities in Cleveland.
Well, Cleveland, but
the
work I do with Move to Amend is national. I'm one of the co-directors. So a lot of the work we do in educating, advocating, and organizing for our We the People amendment, a constitutional amendment that would abolish corporate constitutional rights and money's free speech, has been introduced in Congress, and of course, because of that, it's a national effort.
Oh, sure. Okay, so you were talking about the founding of our nation and how it disfranchised a bunch of groups at the start, virtually all people of color, women, and also a significant number of white people as well, the ones who didn't own property at the start.
Right. Yeah.
And then, I'm sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Complete your statement or question.
And then it was during Jackson, right, when the white people who didn't own property got the right to vote, right?
Somewhere in there, yeah, where they finally were given the rights of of voting and of suffrage. But then it took, many decades later for people of color and many decades after that for women to attain the right to vote. But of course, in the case of women, they're still, only partially having the same rights. That's where the Equal Rights Amendment has come in and has still not been ratified. Although many women claim it has been ratified, and that's sort of been going back and forth in the courts.
Okay. So in regard to democracy itself, from the way you're talking about it, you seem to suggest it's a good thing. Our founders, from what I understand and from what a lot of people have talked about, is they didn't want a democracy. They wanted what they call a republic. So do you differentiate that between your definition of democracy, or are you talking about a pure democracy?
Well, what we have technically is, at the federal level anyway, a democratic republic. There is more of a pure democracy at the state and local level in those couple dozen states that do have the ability to create laws directly via citizen initiative, or to undo laws via referendum, or to kick the bums out, via putting people up and passing a law that would, force them out. So there are, at the local level, in communities that have charter rights bestowed by the state, and again, most states, or majority of states, I think 28, that allow direct citizen initiative. That is direct democracy. But at the federal level, we don't. There is nothing in the Constitution that allows national referendums, national initiatives, unfortunately, unlike other countries. So in that regard, it is less than a democracy. The only one we have in those cases is indirect, with those we elect being surrogates to do our business for us.
Sure. So some people would say that on a national level that would be too difficult to implement. It would be too impractical given the population we have. Would you disagree with that?
Well, maybe before, certainly the case. However, in more recent times, certainly in other countries, there have been efforts to reform, update, amend their various constitutions, Iceland being one case, other countries as well, because of modern computers and being able to participate in, I think Iceland and a couple other places had very robust gatherings of citizens virtually that were debated and discussed before actual votes were taken. So it's quite possible to, look, we have in this country now, right, I don't really watch television or whatever, but all these star program, right, singing stars and dancing with the stars and all that. People can call in or vote in or text in who they think did the best job. And they get tens of thousands. So you can vote for somebody who you think is the best dancer, singer, juggler, whatever. Why can't you vote virtually for something that is just a wee bit more important, like who should elect us, or whether we should have, I don't know, an international trade agreement or some other things that, again, relatively speaking, are a bit more important.
Sure. That's a good point. It's well taken. That's an interesting way to put it. So in regards to the organization Move to Amend, it sounds like it's in response to Citizens United. Is that a big part of it, or was this before Citizens United that it had these ideas?
Yeah, several of us were very concerned about sort of the fundamental lack of real, authentic democracy in which those individuals who are being disaffected by decisions at whatever level it is should have a role in the shaping of those decisions, which hardly exists at every level of government. So we've never had a real, authentic democracy. But anyway, people had come together in sort of seeing the direction of where the Supreme Court was going in 2009, several months before the January 2010 Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, and said this is not looking very promising. So we should come together and sort of anticipate the worst, particularly given the constellation of who was on the court at the time, and came together, and on the very day of Citizens United being decided, launched Move to Amend, and within 48 hours had a couple 100,000 people who had signed the petition calling for not just the reversal of Citizens United, because we at Move to Amend believe that, look, the day before Citizens United happened, we hardly had a democratic paradise. People's voices were not being heard, communities were not being helped, and the rule of law was favoring the super rich and corporate entities over the average person and the needs of the average person. So from day one, we have been about, yes, we need to overturn Citizens United, but we need to go back and address the twin constitutional bizarre doctrines that were very anti-democratic that preceded Citizens United, that which equated money as free speech, that being the Buckley versus Vallejo 1976 Supreme Court decision, as well as that which has given corporations constitutional, never intended constitutional rights. And that goes back to the 1880s. And there have been, many decisions from the 1880s, first one being Santa Clara versus Southern Pacific Railroad that hijacked the 14th Amendment, which, as people may know and listeners may know, was intended exclusively for recently enslaved human beings, to give them and only them as human beings due process and equal protection. But 20 years after that decision, the corporate crowd went to court and said it was all along intended to give them, their clients, corporate entities, due process and equal protection. And all that bizarre, anti-democratic, inhumane, and destructive, harmful to people, places, and the planet decisions have gone on to hijack a variety of other amendments. The First Amendment, right to speak, First Amendment, not right to speak, Fourth Amendment, search and seizure rights, Fifth Amendment, takings rights, and the list just goes on. So the problem preceded Citizens United by decades, if not by a century. So we are about the business of trying to overturn all of that. Not to say that, the very days of the beginning of the Republic was some great, glorious democratic nirvana, because it wasn't. But it's certainly in the cases of corporations having inalienable constitutional rights was not the original intent and the default. Because originally, as some listeners may know, the founders, though they got something very wrong, were very right in being concerned and weary of corporate entities having power. Because after all, the revolution was not just sort of the king against the king of England, it was against the king's military arm, that being the redcoats, but also the king's economic/political arm, that being the crown corporations that the king had bestowed upon certain individuals to do the king's business this side of the Atlantic. Things like the Massachusetts Bay Company, the Carolina Company, the Baltimore Company, other companies, corporations that, not just sort of dealt with trade issues, but ruled, governed, set political decisions. And so this is a revolution against those entities. And the revolution was, in essence, a democratization of those chartered by the king corporate entities to make them either states or commonwealths. So the Massachusetts Bay Company was transformed to become the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The Carolina Company becoming the state, then later both states of North and South Carolina. And the Maryland Company, Baltimore Company, that becoming eventually the state of Maryland, and so on. And so many of, in fact, the majority of the colonies were really not sort of political entities, they were corporate entities. So there was a revolution. So this was on the minds of the colonists who, threw off the yoke of the king and the redcoats, but also the crown corporations. And so at the state level, and it was at the state level, because remember, early on, the first constitution we had was the Articles of Confederation, not the Constitution that we know today. And the Articles of Confederation was very strong in giving states' rights over the federal government, and those states' rights included states controlling and defining very strongly, very sweepingly, what corporations could and could not do via what was known as the corporate charter or license that was initially granted one at a time by the state legislature, that was intended to be a democratic instrument to define what companies could and could not do. Well, of course, corporations hated that notion of being told what to do and being defined by the public. So they sought to, flex their private corporate muscles by escaping democratic control. And one of the four ways they did it was to run to the courts. And so what we have today in terms of the Supreme Court having hijacked corporate, the definition and the ability of we the people to define corporate entities was these corporate constitutional rights.
Okay. So I've never heard the revolution put in that way, and I like to think I've read a lot and listened to a lot about the revolution, so I applaud you for seeing it in a new light.
Well, sad to say, a lot of this stuff has been buried. And, I didn't learn much of this stuff until I got involved with an organization that preceded Move to Men called the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy, POCLAD, POCLAD, POCLAD.org.
Oh,
And I was involved with that group for about 15 years, from 1995 to 2010 before Move to Men got going. And this was a group of frustrated activists, sort of labor activists, consumer activists, environmental activists that were, pledging along, doing their good activist reform work, sort of challenging one corporation at a time, a company that was doing harm to either consumers, labor, workers, or the environment, but felt that, we're constantly playing defense because we're constantly, always trying to stop, right? We're always trying to respond, react, or resist to one corporate harm. And when you play defense like that, guess who's calling the shots? The people playing, or entities playing offense, which are the corporate entities. And we could forever and ever and ever, and oftentimes activists and reformers do forever and ever just respond, react, and resist. And POCLAD said, we got to stop this business. Even though we're not in charge and corporations still rule, we have to stop thinking that way. We have to stop colonizing our minds to say that all we can do is oppose. Rather, we need to start proposing and acting. And part of going on the offense is to go after the very form of the corporate entity and say, no, you don't have any right to exist. You got that because of activist Supreme Court justices, and this was not the intent. And we're going to fight you on this fundamental pro-democratic position. And while we're at it, we're going to abolish the notion that money is defined as free speech. Because if money is speech, those who have the most speech have the most money.
Oh, wow.
Or those who have the most money have the most speech. And that ain't a real good definition of anything approaching real democracy.
Good point. So when the country started, and you were talking about the corporate charters were a method of a check and balance against the corporations, right? So that
Well, more than checks and balances, they were actually doing the defining. They were authorizing. They were instructing. Corporate entities had no rights, only privileges that were defined, that were outlined in the corporate charter. In the same way that today, in most states, if you're a doctor, if you're a dentist, if you're a engineer, if you're any one of, hundreds of individuals that want to go into business, you have to get a license from your state to go into business. And you just don't get that license by, coughing up $100. You have to meet certain conditions. That's what a corporate charter was, having to meet certain conditions that the state defined that included things like, hey, you can only exist for 10 years. You can only, cut down the number of trees necessary to build, your desks or your benches. Or, you can only build that road that became a toll road and charge a toll and make money off of it for, 15 years. And once you, recouped the investment and made a nice profit, guess what? That road that had been private now becomes public and no longer has a toll to it. So those were terms, and of course those terms included, sorry, but you can't be involved in buying other or taking over other companies. You can't change your business. If you're, a toll a road company, you can't go into banking, for example, and you certainly can't be involved in donating money, and in many cases you couldn't even be involved in charitable activities for fear that the persons or entities receiving that charity would become dependent on you. So, the license was a tool, a mechanism to to define what that company could do and could not do to make sure it was providing useful goods and services to the public.
Okay. So similar to what I was asking earlier about democracy scaling, with the business that I run, I formed it under a C corporation. I transferred, it was under sole proprietorship, and then I changed it to a C corporation. And one thing you find out through the process is that there are organizations who they'll run off corporations, they'll send submissions like water. They'll send them like water. So, and basically you don't have to, there's not too much, there's templates nowadays to do that. So would it be scalable this day and age to check corporations like that when there's thousands of corporations forming every day, if not more?
Well, what happened is after the first couple of decades, that particular one-at-a-time chartering got corrupted with companies that wanted to sort of have the market, right? Wanted to have a monopoly on building the mill, let's say, in the town. Didn't want a second company to get a charter to build a mill in that same. So they would, create the charter and make sure, they would bribe or in some way corrupt the state legislature to make sure that another charter was not done. And so what happened is that after usually a couple of decades, those individual charters that were given one at a time by the state legislature, all of that was transformed to creating a specific charter for a general line of business. So all banks had an act, a law that was created that applied to all banks. A separate law was created that again had these very strict terms, but that all the entities that wanted to go into banking, go into woodworking, go into building a toll road had to subscribe to. So general incorporation laws replaced the individual one-at-a-time charter. Okay,
that makes sense. So as they were forming it, as they were going through the process, they found certain things that they were looking for in these charters, and then they made it into a system, and made it into a process where it could
that applied to all potential entries into that industry.
Okay. Wow, that's good stuff. That's interesting. So move to amend. You mentioned that they want to have constitutional amendments. So you think that's the best way to change the political system, or at least in this case, is through a constitutional amendment?
Well, there's a lot of, if you're talking about trying to create a real democracy for the very first time, in this country, there's a lot of things that need to be done. And a lot of changes that need to be made. But if you sort of think about it, the most fundamental way to do it we need obviously to elect better people. We need to have better laws, and we need to have better regulations. But ultimately, what oversees that, overarches or undergirds that, is the basic governing rules of our country. And the basic governing rules are not who we elect, or not laws or regulations or decrees that come down from governors or presidents or mayors. It's the Constitution. The Constitution sort of establishes the boundaries that we can or cannot do, and maximizes or minimizes what we can or cannot do. So that is the arena that we believe is most in need of really change, because we've got this system now that, we can elect, you and I can be elected tomorrow, so, presidents with full-scale powers. But there's certain basic things that we can't, constitutionally do now. If they're not enforced, that's something different. But just basically under the Constitution that we can't do, that exists, that puts us in a box. And it's a box that limits what we can or cannot do. And some of those limitations may be appropriate, but nevertheless, it defines what we can and cannot do. Same with legislators at the federal level, and what states can do. Same thing there. So we think, if you want to create the degree, and what we believe is the crises that we are facing, and crises not just IS, but ES, plural, the crises that we are facing today in this country that certainly includes a democratic crisis and a constitutional crisis, but related to that, because we have these flaws in our democratic/constitutional systems, we've entered and embarked on an economic/financial crisis, an environmental crisis, a social crisis. And if you add these things together, you know, we have a scale and a proportionality that is so severe that the problems that we're having to deal with right now, that are not just individual, these crises, singular, but because they are layered on top of one another, in which one of these things can trigger something else, if not more than one other thing. We have to have a solution that is equivalent in scale or in proportion to the crises multiple that we're facing. And we feel that the scale and proportional solution is really constitutional. That includes the We the People Amendment that would abolish corporate constitutional rights and money's free speech. But my God, there are so many other things that need to be changed within that Constitution. Some believe that it needs to be reformed and amended. Others, hey, it needs to be suspended, and we should just start the whole darn process over again. So that's why we think we're focusing on that arena, because it represents sort of the scale of what we feel is proportionate to the problems we face.
Okay. So for these documents, how would they be worded? For the constitutional amendments, how would they be worded exactly?
Well, you know, it I guess depends on what amendments people are coming up with, and I think the process is these days more important than the product. That if at some point we're talking about, you know, really having a robust and all-inclusive process of trying to create, as like Iceland tried to do, to really involve the citizenry at large in what should a new constitution look like, then how can we involve the general public in an authentic way to sort of, you know, hash out? And Chile just went through a process like this. They got voted down, and they're probably going to come back again. I mean, there's just a lot of activity out there around the world, not in the United States. The U.S. Constitution's been said is the hardest, the single hardest to amend of any on planet Earth. So it's daunting, to be sure. It's difficult. But, you know, it's not impossible. It's been done 27 other times before. We think the ERA should probably be the 28th, so the We the People Amendment should be the 29th. We have this thing. It's called the We the People Amendment, HJR 54. It's been introduced in Congress. It has 85 congressional co-sponsors. It has 3 sections to it. The first one just says, artificial entities such as corporations do not have constitutional rights. So, you know, it's pretty clear cut. Corporations should not have constitutional rights. You know, by implication, that means, well, people should have rights. And some now believe, based on the fate of the earth, literally, in terms of the environment, like in other countries, and now there's over 100 countries that in one way or the other have bestowed nature and different types of nature, rivers or ecosystems or animals having certain inherent constitutional rights. And there's an increasing call for that in this country. So whether it's the persons and persons alone or nature in some way, shape, or form having rights, but certainly not corporate entities. And Section 2 is that money is not free speech. And Section 3 is that nothing in this amendment shall be construed to abridge the constitutional rights of freedom of the press. So because the press these days includes individuals, but it also includes corporate entities, right? It includes organizations that are part of the press. So the press would still be able to operate as the press, even though they may be a corporate entity. So that's what the We the People Amendment, and you can find that, the actual exact wording to it by going to movetoamend.org. That's the organization website, movetoamend.org. The amendment itself, the We the People Amendment, is movetoamend.org/amendment.
Okay. Sounds good. Is there any other way our audience can help you in your efforts?
Well, if they want to keep up with what's going on, you know, we send out a couple emails of talking about what the heck's going on, and particularly over the last couple of weeks, my goodness, some of the decisions that came down from the Supreme Court. We've been commenting on that and, trying to help people dissect that and understand how lethal some of these decisions are to having, the right to define ourselves and our communities, so people can join and get those emails by going to movetomend.org/motion, MOTION, motion. There's over 20,000 people who have signed that motion. Over 700, I think we're up to like 706 or 7 communities that have taken a position, and 8 states that have passed resolutions calling for this amendment. And so that's kind of cool. And so people can go to, if they want to find out information about that, they can go to movetomend.org/amendment, the same thing. And if they want to find out the resolutions, they can go to movetomend.org/resolutions-in-support. And there you can see all the communities around the country that have passed resolutions, cities, counties and the like. So, maybe your city has already passed a resolution, but if not, that would be one way that communities or an individual can support. And we have a template. We have a toolkit that can help people. And then lastly, people can support if they're part of an organization. We're now up to like 773 organizations. And those organizations span the gamut from, community groups, labor organizations, law firms, labor organizations, faith, ethical groups. A variety of organizations have endorsed this effort. And so that gives, obviously a lot of more credibility and expands the awareness of this. So, if individuals are part of an organization that they feel in some way, shape, or form the work they're doing is stymied because of corporate power, because of money, corrupting the political system, well, metaphorically, we're never going to get past first base unless we end corporate constitutional rights and freedom of speech. So therefore, maybe your organization would be willing to, endorse this effort. And if so, just go to movetomend.org/organizations. And there you can see a listing of all the 773 organizations that have endorsed, as well as a link to the endorsement form. So those are a variety of ways people can get involved.
Yes, that's good. Lots of good stuff people can do. So with
and then very lastly, this thing that you started, Create Real Democracy. This is a weekly calendar that I send out each and every Monday morning that tries to help people understand sort of how we got into this fix by understanding history. Because if we don't know sort of what happened in the past, we're truly likely to repeat the same mistakes. So, people can look at that calendar by going to Create Real Democracy, all one word, .wordpress.com. But if they want to get that subscribed, it's free. That calendar, again, it's sent to your inbox by email every week, every Monday morning. You just go to createrealdemocracy.wordpress.com/about. And there is a way you can sign up. It explains what the calendar is all about, as well as a link to sign up so that, you can get that calendar every Monday morning.
Perfect. It sounds like you have a lot of stuff, of substance that people can benefit from.
We try, because, ultimately it's going to have to be you and I and people listening. We need to have the public officials on the inside of the political system doing what they can to bring about, reform, if you want to call it, or radical reform, if you want to call that, or fundamental reform, however you want to do it. We do need friends on the inside. But, a lot of the heavy lifting, historically, has happened in this country and abroad by people's movements who have come together outside the system. And so that's where you and I, people who are listening, come in, and we've got to build a strong democracy movement that includes lots of different people and organizations. And that's really what it is that we're trying to do. Yeah, we're trying to pass this amendment, but we're not under any illusion that this is going to happen short of a strong and powerful robust, and authentically inclusive people's movements. And so that's where all these endorsements and, getting organizations to pass resolutions, to get people, who are elected at the local level, to help change the culture, to make sure people think that what's going on today is not inevitable, it's irreversible, it's not like gravity that, that you can't change, BS. This thing has happened, and the fix that we're in has happened because it's been intentional and deliberate, and just as something has been done, guess what? It's been undone, and it's going to be undone, if it's going to be undone in a democratic, just, and sustainable way because of a people's movement. So we got to change the culture as well as change the Constitution and change the law and get better people elected. So that's where building a movement comes in, and that's where all of you who are listening can help be part of that movement.
Perfect. It sounds like you have good strategy behind this.
Well, try. I mean, we only have so many cards to play, We can't spend because they got the millions and billions that are being spent. My God. And, we're not corporate entities that can throw our corporate weight around. So we got to do what we can, which is build power by coming together, by building community, people power.
All right. Sounds great. So, Greg, thank you for coming on the podcast today and telling our audience about all these things you're doing to make our country more democratic.
Well, thanks. If anyone wants to sort of cut or discuss anything you've heard, have any questions, would like more information, feel free to reach out to me directly. My email is Greg, G-R-E-G, at Move to Amend. That's right. I've got a lot of different email addresses, but maybe that's the simplest one. Greg, G-R-E-G, at movetoamend.org. I'd be more than happy to engage with you.
Awesome. Greg, thank you for coming on the podcast today. We appreciate hearing what you have to say.
Appreciate the opportunity. Appreciate your Thank you.
Sure thing. We wish you all the best in all your efforts here and everything else you do in your personal and professional life.
Thank you. Take care. Be well.
Bye now.